Ready to explore the extraordinary world of tech? Welcome to the XTech podcast, where we connect you with the sharpest minds and leading voices in the global tech community. Join us as we cut through the complexity to give you a clear picture of the ideas, innovations, and insight that are shaping our future.
Hello and welcome to XTech Podcast by Fox Agency. I'm your host, Debbie Forster MBE. I'm a tech portfolio consultant and an advocate and campaigner for diversity, inclusion, and innovation in the tech industry. I'm delighted to be working with Fox Agency as the host for the XTech podcast and as a curator for the XTech community. And today I am really delighted to be joined by Gaurav Kapoor. He's the vice chairman, co-founder, and board member at MetricStream. Welcome, Gaurav.
Thank you, Debbie. Very delighted to be on your podcast.
So, Gaurav, I had a lot of fun researching for this discussion, and you've had a really interesting journey at MetricStream, but I like to take a step further. I love to figure out how guests found themselves in the world of tech. Some born with a laptop in hand, others wake up with surprise and realize they're in tech. How did it happen for you?
So, Debbie, I truly think that it's been an interesting journey. I actually started my career in India and started with Citi. And Citi at that time was a very happening, young, quote unquote, at heart company, very innovative. We were one of the first companies to launch the consumer products like credit cards and home loans and auto loans and stuff in India, mortgages, etc. In fact, we were one of the first ones to actually bring international mutual funds into the country as well as a distributor initially. So when all that was happening, somewhere in the mid 90s, the internet happened. Because we were Citi, we were, helping the US groups as well in terms of how the overall kind of internet, would work. We were one of the first companies in India to get onto the internet bandwagon. While this was happening, there was a very high interest in launching a set of products that could actually tap into the whole international consumer remittance business, if you will, right? As you know, multi-billions go out from the US to other developing countries. And at that time, India was still developing. And that's when the company and I took the call to move to the US, basically. Literally, I was in New York for 7 days before they said that go to Silicon Valley. That's where all the tech stuff is happening. And I moved to Silicon Valley and launched, this is pre-PayPal, essentially an international consumer product, which actually allowed internet-based remittances. And when I came to Silicon Valley, a lot was happening. This was the, early heydays of tech, if you will, or not tech, but at least the internet. And that guided me towards tying up with one of the entrepreneurs in the Valley to start a boutique venture fund, essentially. And while we were, looking at that, the whole idea of governance came in. 9/11, Enron, MCI, all that stuff was happening. And we saw an opportunity. So interestingly, on a personal level, when I was running the consumer remittance business, the last guys we really wanted to talk to was risk compliance audit executives, because we always used to think that they're the breakers, if you will. Okay. They're the policing force, not realizing that the rest of my, life I'm going to be spending creating a company or helping create a company that is going to be focused on risk compliance and governance.
And I think what's really interesting to me is, you were getting into fintech before the word fintech was even a concept. And when you allude to something, a lot of times we talk about great innovation coming through some new discovery, some new innovation. But when you talk about things like 9/11, when you talk about bubbles and crashes, etc., that's tech and innovation coming through crisis. And you've really had to navigate through that, haven't you?
It is. And see, every crisis, as they say, is an opportunity, clearly. And what we realized is that many of the failures had certain patterns, if you will. And I'm not just talking about the big kind of failures we just talked about, but even smaller failures and later on the financial crisis of 2008-9, right? A lot of these, you start to pattern and see what is common to these. And what was common is that one part of the organization wasn't talking to the other part of the organization. As simple as that, right? In a bank, you have groups like operational risk, audit, compliance, and there's a lot of data intelligence sitting, across these groups. But if you don't bring it together, okay, that's when either simple tactical failures happen or more seismic failures happen, where if you can bring all this together, then the opportunity for the organization to see risk holistically, changes the paradigm overall. So absolutely. I mean, we obviously never want to celebrate crisis, but the biggest opportunities also come from the crisis essentially.
And I think it is because what you're talking about there, and we often see this, we know there's a problem or we know there's an opportunity, but people don't necessarily want to hear that at that point in time. And the secret is, one of my favorite quotes, Winston Churchill talks about never waste a good crisis. And those crisis points, if you've been doing your homework, if you know this space, is the time to lean in. That's where you institute change, because people really have no choice, and you can push through and move forward in ways that people might be really resistant beforehand. And you've clearly built that in as part of your whole MO in looking at that. And I really love the journey of going on GRC, going from being the bad guys, the headache, the ones that slow you down, to being something at the engine house of what you do.
And Debbie, the one thing I'll add is, not just at the foundation when the company was being thought through on how and what to attack and what problem to solve, but right through the last 15 plus years, right, there have been quite significant changes in the market. If you look at some of the early cyber attacks, right, that people were not able to decipher where it's coming from and why it's coming, right? That was a crisis situation. I mean, whether it was state sponsored or it was massive infrastructural, cyber attacks that was coming, and after that, cyber became real, if you know what I mean, right? Then you had the biggest possible, I would say, crisis in the last decade, which is the COVID. And that created a whole new opportunity and problem around digitization, which was, people were working from home. They had to digitize a lot of stuff, but that came with a set of risks and, crisis opportunities, if you will, right? Then you get into the world of AI, more recently. Now that's a massive, massive opportunity, clearly, right? The tech disruptions, etc. But it also comes with a very large canvas of risks as well, if it's not managed well. So you've got to be at it. So for us, I mean, we've had to stay ahead of the curve, if you will, right through the journey, not just the initial quote unquote, crisis opportunity spectrum, if you will.
Completely get that. And I think it is understanding. I think there was a time when companies could convince themselves if they understood risk, they would avoid crises. Whereas we need to now understand that's a regular part of the landscape.
Correct.
And I love, let's look at that. You've been driving MetricStream through an AI first transformation. And what triggered that? Because there's a lot of companies still bolting it on or sitting at the sidelines waiting for that. How did you drive that through MetricStream?
Debbie, that's a very interesting question, especially in the world of GRC, because GRC, AI has been there for decades. Okay, accelerated a little more in the last 5 years, and now significantly in the last couple of years, right? So if you look at it, GRC, one of the reasons GRC trailed other functions like sales and marketing or even finance, etc., was because most GRC practitioners, risk executives and compliance executives were very fearful that they can't afford to miss something. It's fantastic to be, 90% accurate on sales and marketing, if you will. It's not okay to be 90% accurate in risk management, because one or two failures that pass through your agentic engine or generative engine can cause $1 billion fine to a bank or to a large corporate, as an example, right? So people were fearful. But what has changed in the last couple of years is that the markets are shifting where, customer behaviors are changing. It's no longer an imperative, primarily because the canvas of coverage of risk has dramatically enhanced. Today, risk is coming not just from cyber. It could be a geopolitical shift, a supply chain shift. It could be because of internal, fraudulent activities, because of high hyper digitalization, if you will. All that has actually expanded quite a bit. And there is no option but for risk executives to tame the canvas of information, using AI, different aspects, and then augment what the practitioners are doing, essentially. I don't know if you're aware, or maybe you are, that in the world of GRC, there are 500 million people in the world who touch GRC every day in some capacity, as employees, as practitioners, as regulators, as consultants, as, the extended supply chain, all of that stuff. 500 million people. That's multiple countries baked into one. Now, what we realized is, after looking at where the real pain points are, we realize that, yes, we're sitting in Silicon Valley. We can talk all day long about LLMs and SLMs and MCPs, but really where we hinged on is what is the real pain that our, market or people in our space are going through. And it boiled down to really two things here. They are overloaded with actionable work that they have to do. I mean, look at us as well as independents. I'm sure you have to, as part of your company, you've got to fill up security questionnaires. You've got to fill up compliance questionnaires, right? You've got to do risk and control assessments all day long, right? And there are literally thousands of people in a single organization that are doing this day to day. So what we said is that let's simplify their lives. Let's use AI to automate the rote work that they do every day, while still allowing them the intelligence that they have around their own business, around the market, to be projected further, but allow AI to use that. And the second thing was that administrators of GRC programs are also equally pained because, large enterprise products, etc., they require maintenance, they require a lot of work, all of that stuff. So just boiling it down to simplifying, and that's why we took the call. We changed our tagline about 6 months ago, calling it GRC Simplified, Outcomes Amplified. So the focus on amplification, and that's the journey we are going through. This is not a short-term journey, but this transformation is a very critical part, because in the next couple of years, the customer behavior is also changing quite rapidly, where they want AI to be used for their efficiency, for their effectiveness, and even the foresight and prediction capabilities. So that's been the transformation.
Again, I'm loving the journey that you're talking about there, because it's not just doing it because we can do it. It's really understanding that user. And you and I both know that at the minute you started talking about anyone in risk, they're the worried, sweaty person in the past. And you had the business case, you had the numbers. But what I like is you've been agile enough that when the tipping point comes, where it becomes inevitable. This is too big, that it can overcome the fear, it can overcome the resistance, because the problem space is becoming impossible. That's the point at which you can lean in and make that real pivot and take your users with you. Too early, they're going to have reasons to not engage with you. Too late, somebody else is in there. It's that keeping that agility, which you've managed to do. So that's fascinating. Now that AI is leaning in and becoming so much important part of the GRC space, looking ahead, is AI going to replace the GRC professionals or maybe just augment them? What do you think?
So Debbie, this is the billion-dollar question, right, on everybody's mind in every company across the world. It's a tricky question, but let me actually start with an example. I was speaking with the chief auditor of one of the largest, oil and gas companies in the world recently. And I asked him the question, you've got hundreds of auditors and thousands of people who are actually responding to these audits, right? What do you think is going to happen? What is your foresight? And he basically said that in one sentence that I will need more auditors. So I was surprised. And I asked him, why do you say that? He said, see, two things. People think that, these auditors are going to be replaced, but these are the auditors who actually are the brain trust of the company, because they know the business from left to right, right to left, top to bottom, because they are the people who are looking at everything from their oil rigs to their internal financial processes to, what's happening with clean energy, all of that stuff here, right? So he said, my aim and desire is to ensure that all the rote work that they do day to day, filling up those audit execution forms and all of that stuff, can be automated. And I want them to be focused on essentially higher, more intellectual and more, domain-centric work that they do. So I asked him, but doesn't that mean that you're going to reduce the number of auditors because a lot of that will be automated? He said, no, I want to increase the canvas of coverage that I see significantly more. Today we do sample testing, etc. I want to do entirely 100% population testing. I want to be auditing things that I could not audit earlier, not from an assurance perspective alone, but looking at, where the unknowns could be coming in from. And these are the people who actually know this inside out. So why would I actually replace them? This is my brain trust of the company, right? So the way I look at it is, we have this assist, augment, and delegate model. And I feel that GRC will start with assist or has started with assist. It'll go into augment. But finally, the delegate model, where things can be automated, will take some time as the models become, more predictable. They become more smart. They have a lot of intel that comes in. But at the end, Debbie, let me also tell you that, AI, it'll be imprudent to say that, GRC professionals will not be replaced by agents, as an example. However, if the skill set, of these professionals keeps expanding more and more into the domain areas they're experts on, then they will not be replaced. They'll actually do more strategic work.
And I think two main points that I love what you're saying is on two levels. It's pragmatic. It knows that things are going to change. So if I'm sitting here worried about my job, is AI coming for my job? If I keep the same skills, the same outlook, the same ways of working, yes, my job will be eaten by AI. However, if I or my company upskill in such a way and have that mindset that I become more and more skilled at using it for those three levels, then there will be a place for me. But I think there's also, Gaurav, this will also be the difference, I think, between good companies and great companies.
Correct.
Because some companies are just looking at, I can make efficiencies.
Yeah.
I can make cuts. I can cut headcount, short-term savings. What I like is that we're hearing some companies saying, actually, this allows me to really fine-tune my workforce to do better, to do more, increase impact, reach, those sorts of things. And I think in the same way that there's going to be a dividing line for professionals, I think there's going to be a dividing line for companies. That genuinely take that long-term view of how do we get better at this, not just let's fix Q1 and cut some savings.
Very well put, Debbie. And that's why I come back that, there are many words you can put, but efficiency is one of the words, okay, or one of the areas that, and there's a high intensity right now in creating efficiencies because of shareholder pressure, because of market pressures, etc. But the real companies that are going to actually make this work are people who increase the effectiveness and also the ability to predict risk better. Because if you can do that, what comes out in terms of both cost saving, but also revenue accretion or growth is going to be substantially offsetting the cost reduction that you might be doing. Right? So AI and GRC is also about growth. It is about strategic risk management where, the good companies I'm talking to right now are thinking about, with all this data, can I actually take more risk in certain areas versus lesser risk? And that's where, when we started the company, that was the vision, that how do you get onto the growth side versus risk being, just a defensive function. And we are starting to see that with AI because of the processing power, we are starting to see that as well.
I've looked at the positive side. There are some concerns, aren't there, when we think about ethical considerations with AI and governance. Can you walk me through it from your perspective?
So, Debbie, I think, I'm going to expand that a little bit if you're okay. One is the ethical considerations. Okay. There are, in the world of GRC, there's a couple of more things here. So if you look at, how companies are governed, okay, there is also this whole question about answerability, about traceability, because regulators, when you build models, for example, to do something, the regulators are going to be after you to make sure that they understand how that model was built, and what is the answerability, what is the traceability, what is the, what is the privacy concerns, okay, what is the data security concerns. And it's not just internal hygiene. Regulators in our world are going to be looking at that very carefully. So if you're providing an audit report to the Bank of England, as an example, right, a bank is providing that, they're going to be looking at not just the audit report because they know that things are changing. They're going to ask about how did you build that model? How did you come up with that answer? A lot more with high scrutiny. So governance or the ethical considerations are extremely important. And what I would say is, if I break down just the ethical considerations as well, that's where, the domain expertise starts to come in very strongly. Now, models can build it, but, people who are living and breathing can start to see that, okay, there are issues here in the ethics of the information. And ethics could be biased, it could be profiling, it could be the volume of data you're pulling in from one aspect, from the other aspect, all of that stuff, right? So the whole balancing, and that's where the concept of eval comes in, where the models can spit out answers, but you've got to ensure you have really deep understanding of the parameters that those answers are coming from. That's going to be very deeply understood. And then you've got privacy, security. But one thing that most people don't talk about, I'm going to highlight this, is the culture and the tone from the top on ethical considerations here. So if the CEO or the chief AI officer says that, yes, I'm looking for efficiency from this, but I'm going to be absolutely brutal about the fact that you guys are considering every aspect of ethical consideration here, then the culture is going to be very different than somebody who's more aggressive saying that let's create the models and create the efficiency, if you will. So the culture is something that sometimes miss because that translates to the whole organization on how they're building these models, how they're getting these answers, and how they're validating, if that makes sense.
And that requires really leaders who truly are grappling with these concepts, not just bolting on, not just jumping on the bandwagon of things. But I think what's interesting in what you're trying to do, I'm hearing more and more people talking about the leader needs to drive the why in how we use AI. But I really like what you're talking about. It's the culture on how are we going to be using it? What are the do's? What are we willing to do? What are we not willing to do? And
Correct.
And not just do a break things fast and fix them later. We have to start thinking ahead, because these are going to be big issues that have huge ramifications for companies and society, aren't they?
They are. They are. I mean, there's a whole spectrum of people that are trying to slow down AI, as you know, and we've seen what's happening in fairly significant dialogues at OpenAI, at Meta, at Google, at Microsoft, where leaders are grappling with, the pace of change versus what you should not be doing at all, right? And you got these civil rights groups who are, also coming at it from the other side, saying that this is actually creating a different kind of acceleration than we'd hoped for. But, at the end of the day, I feel that this whole balancing of innovation and trust, okay, it has to happen with a fierce force.
And I like what you said, because it's trust. Because there's not a truth, is there? There's not a right and wrong. It is how are we creating? And we're seeing some great thinkers in tech starting to return to that concept of what creates trust. How do we create trust? Rather than just what can tech do and why wouldn't we do that? I think it has that. Let me spin that slightly, because you are in GRC, etc. But how do you govern AI when AI is actually doing the governing?
So, Debbie, the concept of governance has been there for a long time in things like model management. If you look at financial services firms, they had model management for years, right? They had models they were building, they had to validate the models, and they had a centralized repository of these models that everybody had to do. Now, if you go back to the core principles, right, simple first principles that we talk about, right, at the end, governing AI is very similar. Okay, so you still have to have, there's a lot of shadow AI happening in the companies. There's a lot of innovation happening in companies. But at the end of the day, if an organization looked at it and said that here's my repository of where my AI models and AI work is happening, here's the 10 things I've got to make sure that nothing leaks through this. And EU has come up with a very, standard practice or standard act that actually defines what governance should look like, essentially. And you follow those principles, okay? It is no different from any other area of risk. The big difference is pace, the velocity, the pace of, investments, of creation of shadow AI, as I call it, of IT, creating new models, or business creating models now, not IT, has changed dramatically. And that's what essentially companies have to figure out, how to keep the velocity and pace and the automation a lot more than the past principles that we had talked about. Yeah. By the way, cyber created the same thing.
Exactly.
And now cyber is a lot more tame. Doesn't mean the cyber risk doesn't exist, but people are not worried about, how. It's not the technology, right? It's not the technology. It's really the whole foundation of how you manage the principles, essentially.
And I want to come to cyber in just a moment, but I think what you're saying, I just find is key to so much that's happening in AI, insofar as, we have been through innovation. We have been through significant innovation before and worked out principles on how companies can do that strategically, ethically, with governance. But as you said, it's the speed, the velocity, and I'd add the sheer scale of money going through the system right now. Tech is losing its mind sometimes because it is all of that. And there's that British phrase of keep calm and carry on. There's just sometimes I want to say that and everybody take a breath. Everybody take a breath.
Yes.
And do what we know how to do, right? Go back to first principles. I'd agree that. But cyber, oh God, we can't have this without talking about cyber. You see this as well as I do. Supply chain attacks, third-party breaches are just surging. Why? Why do you think that's happening?
So, Debbie, I touched upon a little bit earlier that, the pace of digitization, technology disruptions that are happening across, whether it's cryptos, regular digitization, the whole thing that's happening with AI, also state-sponsored attacks in. The geopolitical world is very different. And last thing I'd say is shadow IT. Okay, the need for speed has created a whole, kind of new risk because everybody's trying to create their own apps. I'm not even talking about AI here, right? Even other things here, correct? So that's, the core kind of foundation reasons why this has happened. But I will tell you that since you mentioned more about supply chain, and cyber attacks in the same breath, what has happened is the attackers have really shifted from breaching the fortress to infiltrating the ecosystem. So the fortresses have strengthened, but the ecosystems have weakened because there's a whole ecosystem that works. Everybody has partners and partners have partners. Okay. And so that's the primary thing. The dependency is very high. I'm going to just finish with an example here. One of the largest payment networks in the world, they got breached a couple of years ago. They are supremely focused on cybersecurity. They have their own cybersecurity products. They've got the best minds in the world, working on the cybersecurity. But there was a small store in Indonesia from where the attack came. Okay. And it got compromised and it basically created a risk that could have taken down the entire financial system. They stopped it in time, but it took them time to recover. So that's the reason. Okay. So it could come from anywhere, basically.
And I think this is what we always need to think about when we're thinking about cyber. The obvious places are shored up and they're safe now because they're obvious places. And for every company, we are only as strong as our weakest point. And that comes down to a little shop in Indonesia, somebody that's using a smart kettle down the corner. It is thinking through all ramifications of that rather than just let's keep doubling down on the front door. They're coming in the side door. They're coming in the back door in that respect. And that's when we need to start looking. Okay. So we've covered all the things that can go wrong and all the things that can go right. I want to finish back with you as a human. What's on the horizon that grabs your interest at the moment? It could be part of your day job or more widely. What is capturing you?
So Debbie, this is a very interesting question because there's so much change happening right now that you could get flustered and you could think about 10 different things, not sleep at night. But if you go back to the core principle, I think the biggest thing on top of my mind is, am I going to be able to, and our company be able to keep pace with the product market fit that's constantly changing? Customer requirements are changing, and new technologies are emerging. But at the end of it, the most important thing for a company to thrive and to keep innovating is to ensure that they're very close to what the product market fit is. What that means is, tying customer needs in the spectrum of, our target market and ensuring that we are ahead of the curve. We're not lagging, we're leading them into this journey. And that's what my time goes in. I spend a lot of time with my customers, day in and day out, just trying to understand and also helping them, pattern what other organizations are doing so that we can lead them and not necessarily be led by them.
And I think part of that greatness, because Gaurav, I have to say, that's a fantastic way of seeing it. I think you've managed to hold on to that entrepreneur that started the journey back in India, because what you're talking about is that startup mentality, isn't it? It is that product client user fit. It's not it's cutting through all the noise on what is the latest innovation, what is but just understanding a razor close understanding of what is my client, my user, my customer want or need, and are we meeting that need? If you do that, it filters the noise in the direction. So again, it's that going back to first principles, isn't it? That is where success is going to be.
Yes.
Okay, look, we've been everywhere. Fascinated with how you're going to tackle this. I love hearing from our guests. What are they reading, watching, listening to that they would listen to us, that charge the batteries, that keep us thinking? What is it you're reading or watching or listening to?
So Debbie, I'm going to give you two answers. The first answer is I'm really reading my inbox, and it's a story. It's a thriller. It's a mystery. It's comedic and occasionally horror. Okay, so that's the first thing. Okay. So,
and I wish it was fiction. I wish my inbox was fiction and not nonfiction, isn't it? Yeah.
True. So that's one. The other thing I think, that I'm reading or I have gone back to reading is, an author, Nicholas Taleb, who wrote the book Black Swan and Anti-Fragility. And I had the opportunity of actually interviewing him on one of our summits, okay, where we were on stage together. And a lot of the concept of anti-fragility is coming back. So the whole concept of anti-fragility is about creating simulated shocks in the system, okay, so that when the real thing happens, okay, you said it earlier, right? You said it earlier that you can't avoid risk, you can't avoid crisis, it's how you handle it. And anti-fragility gives a very good framework, okay? And I'm not talking about theoretical framework, it's more philosophical on how to think about creating simulated shocks in the system so that when the real one comes, you're really prepared and best prepared. Yeah? So I would always urge people to go back and, at least read an excerpt of that, because that concept is 15 years old or 20 years old, but even more, with all the space innovation we're talking about. Yeah.
Oh, I was going to say, what must have seemed right out there and just, planning for the what if 15 years ago. Nowadays, it's preparing for what happens Tuesday, not some dim, distant future.
Exactly.
Super. Okay. Look, this has been fantastic. Thank you so much for joining us, Gaurav, today. I really enjoyed talking to you on this episode of XTech.
Thank you, Debbie. Pleasure to talk to you. And, your style and your way of questioning has been awesome. And thank you for having me here.
And thank you to all of you for joining us on this episode of XTech. If you'd like to appear as a guest on the show, don't waste a minute. Email us now at xtech@fox.agency. I'd like to thank our whole team of tech experts at Fox Agency for making this podcast possible. I'm Debbie Forster, and you've been listening to XTech.
Keep exploring the world of tech. Subscribe to our podcast and never miss an episode. To discover more opportunities for global B2B tech brands, visit fox.agency today.